and there's even evidence to show this is a great study, that funders who were reported back that some of the projects they were funding weren't working, it actually increased their trust and they grew their funding. Because from what I've read and what I've experienced, funders and investors, yes, they want impact, but they actually want trust, right? And that's just a human, it's all relationships. I love how Simon Sinek says, the people in your business, they're people. Your team, they're people. And so a lot of this is trust. And so even if you're reporting, hey, that didn't go as well as we thought it would, and some people don't say do that impact evaluation because they're afraid of that, the evidence suggests that you'll actually increase trust and funding from your investors.
Welcome to the Feast Over Famine podcast. On this podcast, we're navigating the tension that we find where mission and profit collide. We're talking to CEOs, founders, executive directors, impact investors, and all of what we've identified as the global ecosystem of the social enterprise, business for transformation, business as mission landscape. We're talking to them about the obstacles they face, the strategic challenges they've been through, how they're funded, how they were started, and everything that's happened in between. We are trying to share their story in a way that's impactful to help us all to grow the social enterprise space for the better. Enjoy this week's episode with your host, Ryan Mahaffey.
All right, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Feast Over Famine podcast. Really stoked everybody's here. And I'm really excited for this episode. It's been a long time coming with my buddy James Waters from Europe. He'll let you know exactly in Europe as he's jet setting around the last week or so from Norway, I think, to the UK and all over the place. But really stoked to have him on. James is someone that I've met in the past 6 to 12 months and has a really awesome mind for using data and measuring impact on the for-profit side and the nonprofit side, and really helping organizations to grow and scale internally, to think about externally what their impact is. And I was just super impressed by that, their business model, the tools that they're building, and just really excited to share that. So James, welcome to the podcast, man. Really excited we're finally doing this.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Yeah, it's been a long time coming. I'm so excited to be on.
Yeah. And for anybody that's out there listening to the podcast, maybe for the first time and saying, wow, like Ryan, you sound terrible. Like, it is allergy season in Colorado. I think James has a little bit of caught something traveling over in Europe there. Yeah. So we're just rolling with this thing, casual, having a lot of fun, sounding as professional as we can, and just grinding for the kingdom and having fun, right?
Amen. Rolling with the punches.
That's how we do it. That's awesome. Well, James, so why don't we start here? Like, tell everyone a little bit about your story, your career, why you care about this kind of stuff, and how you've ended up where you're at now, and then we can dive into all the crazy details.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So my career started in kind of research and international development. I did a PhD looking at the resilience of slum dwellers. I did a PhD mainly because when I finished my master's, it was the economic crash, to be totally honest. But it was just a fascinating PhD, and I had the privilege of living more or less in a slum in Kampala, and being amongst slums in Kampala for a year. And that was just fascinating, being at the coalface of poverty and developing surveys and ways to look at individuals' resilience, which was just fascinating. And anyway, I went from there to working as an international development consultant for a few years, and for a large engineering firm, global engineering firm. So I got to work with the UN and Rockefeller Foundation and USAID and some of these other big players, thinking about really big global problems like climate change in Asian cities, or how to think about resilience of cities and a kind of whole city level, even regional level. And so that was an amazing few years there. And around about 2017, I started to get really inspired by impact investing, and specifically how social impact metrics, and even not just metrics, but language, tools like B Corp, even at the highest level, the Sustainable Development Goals, were kind of coming into play, and from my sort of perception, kind of helping to catalyze this growth of people investing in impactful companies, social enterprises, organizations, but also just holding nonprofits and for-profits to kind of higher account in terms of standardized metrics. And so kind of segueing into what I'm doing now, I was kind of inspired, but also frustrated. And the frustration piece was that I also led quite a bit of Christian mission and development work, and just a lot of the organizations I work with had great vision. Honestly, I had friends that could raise a few $100,000 in the evening and for amazing causes, but from where I was standing, not much strategy or awareness of what was working. And sort of, counteracting that with my day job, and sometimes I joke, you don't get money from the Rockefeller Foundation twice without, giving them a hefty report. And so I was like, could these two worlds intersect a bit better? Could I serve the faith-based world on the nonprofit and for-profit side by bringing in the best of kind of social impact measurement, and then thinking critically about, can we measure spiritual impact? What does overall kingdom impact look like? And could we measure it? And so that's been my hard graft, adventure, joy, business, and all of those rolled into one of the last 5 years.
That's awesome. There's a lot to unpack there. But one thing that I think is cool, I think almost everybody in this space has a story around some form of recognition of the tension. I mean, like our mission statement is the tension, navigating the tension of mission and profit collide, right? And so you were just talking to, man, I saw this impact happening and these are my friends and they're having an awesome impact, but over here, there's like not as much strategy and they're not really using the insights. And so there's this recognition that there's this miss between the for-profit and nonprofit world in relation to the impact that we can have. But then it goes layer deeper where the person kind of wrestling with that recognizes how their own skill set can like fit into that. And for you're like, well, look how the strategy of these metrics and all this and impact data and all this stuff can fit in there. So a really, really cool story on that front. So talk to me about where you guys are at today. You've got the Kingdom Impact Framework. Obviously, Eido Research is another thing you have. We're focusing mainly on Kingdom Impact Framework, but I guess talk to me today about, is it a, serve, and I know the answer to this, but tell us like service, product, like what is it that you guys have? What is it that you're doing? And then we can break through some of the pieces of that. Yeah,
sure. So, I mean, as Eido Research, we've done so many different projects over the last 5 years. And I guess one of the things we've learned is with enough time thinking through the strategy and really focusing in on getting real clarity on the outcomes that people want, I wouldn't say you can measure anything. And one caveat I would say is, this is quite often comes to me, can you truly ever, actually say the state of a person's heart? No, but you can, get proxies of what is happening in terms of social and spiritual impact. But so that on the one hand is we've just, had the privilege of measuring such a variety of things, from capturing hope to, people's success in careers. So a huge variation. And then in terms of tools and the project that I take a lead on, as you mentioned, the Kingdom Impact Framework, I spent a couple of years really dialing in on a beneficiary or participant survey, more aimed at nonprofits. And so we've actually piloted in 4 or 5 different countries now. So that's a standardized social and spiritual well-being survey that looks to capture impact, in the ground, in programs, which is awesome. So that's on the kind of more nonprofit side. And then the other tools that we've developed and are fully out there, I was just feeding back to about 9 different leaders on this, is on the more internal piece. So the Kingdom Impact Framework kind of organizational assessment, and that looks at the internal health of an organization, and where I still call that impact, because quite often we forget that we as leaders, we're having impact on the people around us, our teams, even our peers, and potentially even the people above us. And so that's the other tool we have that we have rolling out there, where it's completely standardized and nearly fully automated. And we've just had our first large Christian development organization take that, because they're like, we really want to make sure our values are coherent internally, as well as obviously caring about that external impact. So they're the two sort of sides of what we're developing, and it's exciting, to kind of get it out there and be working with organizations and see them change and hopefully demonstrate Christ even better.
Oh, it's awesome. And I've always been a huge fan of how can we capture data around what we're doing and show that from, the minute, I don't want to say minute, but like the small internal metrics to like the big internal metrics. And then we call them big societal metrics. Like, okay, in 10 years, if we succeed at what we're doing, what's going to happen on society? Like, our graduation rates for kids going to increase, our divorce rates going to change, or this. And I think those ones are a lot harder to measure sometimes, but are really important, because it's saying, well, if we do a good job, these numbers will change. And so keeping our eye on that, like, bigger prize there. So let's break down, I guess, a few different areas. And I don't even know where to start, because I've got a lot of notes here. You talk, like, let's start with like kind of, and you guys have a cool process for this. I know you've told me about, you mentioned like getting clarity on the outcomes people want. And so part of the first phase of what you guys do is just even helping people think about and strategize, what metrics do we want? Why do we want them? I know you guys have some tools for that, some process for that. And I know that there's, you guys have learned the best ways to do that. So I guess if I'm an organization kind of thinking about that, how does that look? What are the questions you guys ask? What are the tools you use? How do you guys approach that?
Yeah, it's great. So, I mean, first of all, I'd say, this is absolutely critical. Like, if you're a business, you wouldn't expect to be profitable without a business plan. If you were, non-profit, you probably wouldn't expect to raise money without a fundraising plan. And I would suggest you shouldn't expect to have impact without an impact strategy. So some people call this like a theory of change. Personally, I've seen lots of organizations develop theories of change, and they get so complicated and convoluted that they sit on a shelf, and there's not enough accountability. So we've really simplified this down, and especially my colleague Phil, with decade of experience working inside organizations, and simplified this down to really focus on 5 questions. First of all, like, what is the problem in society that you're trying to address? Secondly, who are the people? Specifically, which people are you going to interact with? Thirdly, what are the outcomes? So this isn't just activities. This isn't just inputs, but what are the outcomes that you want to see in those people's lives? Fourthly, and we're specific about this order, otherwise people jump to what they do before they actually define what they want to see. So fourthly, the activities. What are the activities you're going to do to see those outcomes? And fifthly, what are the success factors? I.e., what is it specifically about your organization that will make you successful in that context? And then for each of those, we ask what evidence they have, and also what's the role of faith and God in their thinking. And so we try and make it both a kind of evidence-based and faith-integrated way of thinking about their impact strategy.
Love that. I love that. Yeah. And I love how it's a conversation. It's not like a prescribed one size fits all thing. We try to take that approach of strategy for clients as well, where we, like, I don't know, everyone's unique. They don't fit in a box. So there's a process, but there's questions to ask to kind of collaboratively create that. And I love that approach for you guys. And I think for impact measuring, so how do you balance the tension for you guys around standard practices around measuring outcomes and putting that in place, while also saying, wow, this is unique? For example, what works in Kenya might be very different from what works in Malaysia versus London versus the US, right? For different reasons. How do you guys handle that tension where you're saying, kind of putting your foot down and saying, hey, this is the best practice way to do it, and then being creative? How do you approach that, even just as a business leader on that?
Great question. We try and hold the tension, basically. So for example, in developing the Kingdom Impact Framework nonprofit survey, participant survey, I've sat with some thought leaders who developed a consortium of leading Christian development organizations, pulled together the best of their metrics, sat on panels with professors, got like people who have written PhDs on Likert scales, really got the best of academic critique and rigor. But also then sat down with those organizations and said, okay, how can we make this possible for an organization that, doesn't have $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 to spend on their annual reporting, right? And so my heart is to, and that's why we're looking to standardize. And the really cool thing is we're developing some partnerships on the software side. That's not like we're not sort of tech people, but we're developing really cool partnerships that make this really possible. I'm just having a conversation with somebody developing some really cool software around SMS surveying. And so we try, and similarly with go back to the survey development, whenever I'm piloting a survey, I then sit down with the surveyors at the end and say, hey, what worked and what didn't? Because you know what, like those professors, their input is really valid. But as valid is, the 19-year-old in the field who's collecting the data and just says, hey, that's a bad question. And so,
totally. Yeah.
That question just doesn't work or is offensive and so we try and hold those two things in tension, because ultimately, like, we all, I come from a research background, but I'm not here to write a research paper. I'm here to help people see if their programs are having impact or not. So.
Totally. Yeah. No, I love that. I love your example of the person in the field that's like, that is a bad question. Like, we're not going to ask that one,
Yeah. And I've had that. Like, I've had everywhere like that, and I've had to shred some of my surveys. So yeah, it keeps you humble.
Oh, that's awesome. That's funny. Let's talk about some of the different buckets of metrics. So you've talked about internal metrics, external metrics, spiritual impact, societal impact, maybe. Are there like 4 or 5 buckets that you put all those metrics into that we could break down, or how would you talk about those?
Yeah, I guess because it's how I've packaged them. I'll talk about it in the sort of tools that we've developed, if that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
So I guess that the way that we've, and because it's come out of conversations, we actually haven't received some massive chunk of funding or investment, whatever. We sat down with our partners and gone, what would be useful? And we're open to feedback, So from my perspective, there's, first of all, Christian leaders, or faith-driven leaders, and are they thriving, in who they are and what they're doing? Like, that's the first thing. So, and I'd say that just because that's the main sector of organizations that we work with. So first thing is leadership survey. So helping leaders understand if they're thriving and if what they're doing in their organizations is likely to have an impact. That would be number one. Second of all, internal. So that's, we've taken some really amazing frameworks from people like Practice and Faith-Driven Entrepreneur, Faith-Driven Investor, and they're thinking around what is a redemptive organization? What are impactful organizations? And those are kind of internal metrics of both culture and well-being of people inside the organization. And I'd call that internal impact, because people do get impacted significantly by the places in which they work. And then thirdly, the external impact, i.e., what's the impact on the people with whom you're working? And that's the survey I kind of spoke a bit more about.
Yeah. And I assume there's different seasons that these, like, obviously an organization could say, hey, we're going to do a massive impact, reporting season, and we're going to look at all this stuff, but there might be different seasons to do different of these, right? So there might be a you might be going through a strategic planning process and you say, hey, we want to get a baseline. So we're going to do some survey of metrics of where that is. And then we'll do it again every year to see kind of our progress. Also might be an organization in turmoil, an organization that has had toxic leadership and new leadership comes in and is trying to understand where it's at, almost like an engagement survey. And so it's not necessarily that all these buckets are right at every single season, but that they can kind of stand alone. And now there might be times that it's like, hey, we want to do a holistic overview of all this kind of stuff. But I think there should be some thought that goes into that. And it sounds like there is, which is pretty cool. On this, and we're obviously a lot of the organizations and people and businesses and stuff that come on the podcast, we have a faith-based bend, but we're not like an overly Christian podcast in that sense necessarily. And we've got all sorts of listeners, but on the spiritual impact side, if we're going to hone in on that from a faith-based, like Christian organization, looking at that, what does that part look like? Like, what are the things you guys are measuring? How are you even measuring that? I know you mentioned maybe doing work with, YWAM at different times or different organizations. So I'm really curious to unpack that one a bit more.
Yeah, great. And internally, externally, or both?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess I was thinking more externally, but it's, I guess there's different buckets of how people approach that.
I'll answer both.
Yeah, answer both. That's interesting. Yeah.
So yeah, great question. So internally, so it's interesting, and yeah, from my background, that's why I'm primarily working with those faith-based organizations. So, but internally, effectively, you have frameworks. We've built on frameworks that define a healthy organization, but then there's elements whether people want to kind of switch them on or off, that speak more to kind of spiritual impact. So to give you an example, like there's a really big or there's a growing movement around sort of purpose-driven business, and that applies to everyone. But there might be an element, if you come from a faith-based perspective, of kind of framing that as calling or kind of God-given purpose, right? And so some of these are like sort of overlapping concepts depending on your worldview. And so on the internal organizational health assessment, I'd say that kind of 90% of our kind of kingdom impact assessment there, is really just measures if an organization is healthy, and then with 10% that's kind of more overtly around faith. But as I mentioned, I mean, we actually ran that in a very sensitive context where they just needed to turn that off completely, and so we actually called it the healthy business assessment, and it was super useful to them. So then externally, in terms of say people going through programs or various programs that organizations running or being impacted in the community, we look at like kind of what's already developed in terms of social impact. So there's some great like poverty metrics that are already standardized, and then on the spiritual, it's things like identity, spiritual rhythms, and then if people desire it, asking questions around kind of experience of God or intimacy with God. And so there's ways to ask these things that can give you a pretty interesting kind of full picture of people's kind of well-being. Did that answer your question?
100%. And I actually, even though I wasn't asking it originally, like really appreciated the internal part of it, because I was like, oh, that's actually a really cool perspective and a reason leadership might even want to care about that kind of thing, because it's overarchingly, how are they doing and all that kind of stuff. So very cool. And
I guess just to play back, sorry, I mean, just to play back, like, in case this helps kind of make sense for people, the way I would think about it is that, of course, we all want our organizations to be like impactful, like externally in terms of what we're doing, and that's super, super important. But I would say like it's almost as important in the same context of kind of culture for business will quite often drive performance, I would suggest those kind of those wider values, even internal to a non-profit, looking to have impact on the field, like how thriving is the person that's delivering that program, or delivering that feeding program, or delivering that teaching, how well are they feeling loved and modeling the values of the organization. So that's the kind of the way that we kind of put those two things together.
Yeah. And it's so important. I mean, because it's all related. And so, yeah, that's cool. That's a cool approach to it. And I think really important. Again, I think organizations can take different pieces of this puzzle and use them at different times and different seasons, which is great. All right, everyone, I want to take a quick break from today's episode and just share a little bit about Impact Foundation, who's got an incredibly awesome model of using impact investment, charitable dollars, and funding tons of projects all over the world right now. What if your investments could change the world? At Impact Foundation, they believe business with purpose has the power to transform society. Purpose-built for impact investing, Impact Foundation provides a streamlined way to fund businesses that seek social and spiritual transformation or make loans to charity, all while earning a financial return to grow your giving. Donors and investors have already supported more than 200 redemptive enterprises through their impact accounts. They provide needed fuel for companies that exist as a force of God's redemptive work in the world. To learn more about what they're doing in their Kingdom Impact Investing model, visit impactfoundation.org. So let's shift gears slightly then, and let's talk about impact investing. So that's almost a different approach, because you might say, okay, I'm going to raise capital in an impact investment standpoint, and we'll define capital as that could be a capital campaign for a nonprofit outside of their traditional fundraising. That could be a equity investment in a for-profit business, and anything in between, a debt offering or something. So there's the organization itself saying, hey, we want to be able to measure these things for impact investors, right? Anyone investing want to be able to measure and share those. Then there's the actual investor saying, hey, I want to know these things before I make an investment. I want to know what's going to be tracked, or just saying, hey, I'd love to know that. And then there's almost a third bucket, which is saying a fund, impact investing fund, a VC fund, a private equity fund, a family foundation, saying we want to overarchingly see the impact of our work for our shareholders or our stakeholders or different people like that. There's a handful of different buckets there. And I know you've worked in the impact investing space in a few ways. And, any of those stakeholders that I just mentioned might be interested in paying for this because of the value of it. But situationally, it's different. So talk to me a little bit about that piece of it and how that's different and how you guys approach that stuff.
Yeah. Well, specifically for the our kind of internal organizational assessment, I mean, we developed that in dialogue with impact investors. It was like these focus groups I convened were both investors and also kind of practitioners, business leaders, and entrepreneurs, right? So I was asking both sort of sides of the coin, hey, what would be useful to you? Now, the challenge is probably some funds might not want to run an assessment on every single organization in their portfolio. But I mean, I would actually say the value you're going to get from that and seeing how healthy those organizations are, and if you actually invest in them and you want them to be impactful, it's almost should be a non-negotiable. But that's
totally
personal opinion. And there's some other factors about look, these are busy entrepreneurs. You know what I mean? Anyway, so we've really positioned it to try and be a value add for the investor as well, and kind of even so there's some funds or investors that we're talking to that, for example, we're about to launch an automated leader assessment, and they really want to use that almost just as a due diligence piece, not necessarily to kind of grill a leader on the results, but kind of just help create a conversation about their thinking towards impact and their thinking towards just they're treating their employees. And so that's a kind of entry point. We've then had other funds that said, we want to make this, we're going to cover half the cost of this and make this available to our whole portfolio. And then they've been able to kind of, compare and see the health of different organizations within them. And then in terms of, you mentioned the kind of say the nonprofits looking to raise a big bit of grant funding, I think even on that piece, like that's probably where I go back to kind of real clarity on outcomes. In fact, we actually are having a conversation and might actually release a workshop soon with a grant writer, and her feedback was the number of organizations that come back and just say, I just keep being asked for more kind of evidence of impact. And so I think I think there could be a better partnership here, and where we want to really support organizations, even if it's just at the very beginning of, and maybe they only have capacity of just articulating that impact, saying, this is the list of outcomes that we intend to have, and here's the strategy. Then I think that shows to investors or funders like a real intentionality, right? Because I think even in the faith-based secular, there's quite a bit of impact wash.
Yep.
And so our heart is to kind of help there not be that.
Yeah. Oh man, it's just the thought of organizations taking that approach is exciting. Because the impact investing space is just young still, right? And it's still a little bit figuring out what it wants to be when it grows up. And so I think that data is, for all the ways you described it, is really, really needed. And I guess that leads into my next question. What I was going to maybe touch on leads into the question that I had for you. So I'll just ask it and then we could talk about it. Was the investment in this process? When is this an appropriate investment? To what degree is it the right investment? Who pays for it? And so let's, if I'm if I'm a nonprofit with $100,000 a year budget, I'm a small nonprofit in Colorado, or if I'm a major one, or if I'm a business that's this size or that size, is there kind of a sweet spot in the season of an organization or size of an organization that this is holistically appropriate? Obviously, a small organization doesn't have, $50,000 to invest in this process, right? And so is it saying, hey, do this little bit here and that little bit there? Is it something that, So I guess I could ramble on about that, but what are your thoughts on that and how to best approach it? And maybe too, where in the priority of things that they can invest in those seasons is this important? Yeah. For example, hiring another team member, or do this, something like that, when they might be thinking that way.
Yeah. And I mean, I know and feel these tensions personally, right? running a small business myself. So I totally get, do you hire? Great question. So I think in terms of the impact strategy, first of all, I'd come back to the analogy of a business plan. And I would say almost don't start without it. And I would say from experience, you can, but you'll probably get into difficult water later. And if you're looking to kind of raise, even just that intentionality is hey, we're a small organization, but we're super clear on our vision and we're super clear on our intended, and it doesn't, we're talking about not large amounts of money, and we quite often just kind of give away templates to help organizations in that regard, and are really flexible. So that would be kind of my starting point, to be super clear on your impact strategy. And then I think, like you said, it's working out working out where to bring in the other aspects. I mean, personally, I think kind of knowing the health, as soon as you're a decent sized team, so probably when you're just, one person, you should still be kind of having self-awareness of how you're doing. Then when you're decent, when you're 2 or 3, no, not necessarily, but as soon as you're a decent sized team, then having an understanding of the health of organizations, that becomes really, really important. Otherwise that will, hold you back. And then, you're not going to be wanting to do a huge baseline if your activities are not great. But what I would say here is, standard practice in the sort of development space is to spend 10% of budget on impact evaluation and learning. And quite sometimes we see organizations, not wanting to spend 1%. And so I would just say that, like, having that, there's even evidence to show this. This is a great study that funders who were reported back that some of the projects they were funding weren't working. It actually increased their trust and they grew their funding, because from what I've read and what I've experienced, funders and investors, it's, yes, they want impact, but they actually want trust, right? And that's just a human. It's all relationships. I love how Simon Sinek says, the people in your business, they're people. Your team, they're people. And so a lot of this is trust. And so even if you're reporting, hey, that didn't go as well as we thought it would, and some people don't say do that impact evaluation because they're afraid of that, the evidence suggests that you'll actually increase trust and funding from your investors. So I'm aware I've kind of said, you should do it all, but no, at different stages, definitely start with definitely make sure you've got a clear strategy. Make sure you're healthy as a leader, and then at the right time, even if, and this is where I'd apply the principle of lead data. If you've got that clear strategy, if you're really clear on the outcomes, there might only be 5 or 6 things that you just want to, but start gathering them from the beginning, and you'll be very grateful at year 5.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer, because I feel like that's not always the answer people give. It takes humility as a business owner to say that your product isn't relevant all of the time, right? And so I think it's I guess not relevant, but you get what I'm saying. So thank you for that approach. I love that. And with the trust piece, I also think it's accountability, right? Because as leadership changes, it is trust and accountability too, that they can look and see that. And I think it gets away from some of the things that I think are, when you look at the traditional nonprofit fundraising realm, some of the things that are really annoying to me, this kind of hopefully with some critical thinking will get rid of. For example, the 80-20 rule that a lot of grants have when they look at your 990, 80% program, 20% admin and fundraising or whatever. It's just not always realistic. There's organizations that invest in strategically scaling for a couple of years and they're admin heavy because of that, but that's actually the right thing to do. And so I think if some of those organizations can, on their side, can start, like the funding organizations can start looking at this data and have their own practices around it, and value it, it'll actually lead to just better funding for organizations that might need it, that might not fit the mold, but actually are doing the impact and are making that work happen. So I think, I think there's some cool pieces on that side too. So I'm glad you dove in on that one. Well, James, this is awesome. I love talking about this stuff. It's super important. It's super fun. Maybe just as we're closing out, can you share one story of an organization, and maybe you can't say exactly who they are, the type of organization that this was a very transformative kind of process for them, and some of the outcomes of that, just to kind of inspire people with a real life example? Yeah, great. So this is an unpolished example from the pool I literally just got off. So I was feeding back to some leaders on a KIF internal organizational health assessment. And I said to them, hey, what was valuable to you? And one of them, one of the leaders, a really humble guy, said it was the perception mismatch between myself and my team. And he said, in that a lot of the team just didn't think we were generous as an organization. They're a sort of social enterprise business. He said a lot of the team didn't think we're generous as an organization. And I didn't get it, because we have these trips and we're doing this work in the community, and we even give away some of our profits, et cetera, et cetera. And so he said, so I went and asked the team. He said, and he suddenly realized the team just didn't know that the company was doing half of this stuff. And so for him, it wasn't that he actually necessarily needed to change something kind of foundational about what they were doing. But like, it was a sort of internal communication piece that suddenly made his team
appreciate the company for more. And I'll just give one other one that's a little bit different. And this was a different leader who, and we've had this a few times, was having incredible impact as an organization, but externally in terms of the work they were doing in a developing country, and in terms of looking after their staff, their managers, both in the field and in their factories. But their leadership had quite a poor work-life balance, and this was being felt by some of the managers. And so managers, this is common thing. If you model it, then the people beneath, below you think that they have to do it as well. And so a lot of them were just exhausted, and so they realized, we've been in startup mode a bit too long, and I think we need to probably just make sure our people don't burn out. So there's just a couple of examples that literally
love it.
Were enacted upon straight away, and hopefully will lead to a couple of healthier organizations.
Totally. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, and I think one thing I've picked up on this podcast, even from past conversations, is I've been looking at very macro, but it's really clear to me, James, you have a heart for healthy organizations and healthy for the right reasons internally. And obviously there's this whole external piece, but even in those couple examples, just the internal kind of clarity and health of a team and how they function and knowing if that's right, then the impact they actually have externally is going to be even better. And so cool learning for me on this podcast, just to hear your specific heart for that and your passion for that and what that is. So James, thanks for being on, man. Super fun conversation. Really excited to share it with the world. And I'm excited to keep partnering with you in different ways and continuing that relationship.
Awesome. Well, love the work that you're doing, Ryan, and great to be on here today.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to another week of the Feast Over Famine podcast. We are so thankful you guys are here and listening. As always, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast listening apps. We would love to keep you guys up to date on new episodes that are coming out, when we're launching new episodes, when we're launching new seasons, and everything in between. So when we're in season, episodes are dropping every single Wednesday. Hit that subscribe button. Make sure you're up to date. Also, if you're loving what we're doing, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, where we're constantly posting about our projects, what they're doing, what kinds of things we're working on. We'll recycle some podcasts, things about our partners, all sorts of fun stuff that you want to see. So hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff, and check out what we're doing there. And we're stoked that you guys are listening. We hope this has been really fruitful, and we will catch you guys next week. And lastly, as you guys all know, we always talk about all sorts of things with impact investing, investment opportunities, entity structure modeling, how projects are getting capital. And as a disclaimer and a reminder, Feast Over Famine does not provide legal, tax, accounting, or other professional advice. You should consult professional advisors concerning the legal, tax, or accounting consequences of any activities related to your project or a project you're supporting. Feast Over Famine doesn't consult, advise, or assist with the offer or sale of securities in any capital raising transaction. We don't do that for the direct or indirect promotion or maintenance of a market for any securities. And Feast Over Famine does not engage in any activities for which an investment advisor's registration or license is required under the U.S. Investment Advisors Act of 1940 or under any other applicable federal or state law, or for which a broker's or dealer's registration or license is required under the U.S. Securities Exchange Act of 1934 or under any other applicable federal or state law. So there's your investment disclaimer. Hopefully that's helpful if you need it. And if you ever have any questions on that side of things, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Take care.